What if I told you that one county in Georgia carried a secret so disturbing? 3 entire generations refused to speak of it. Between March of 1838 and September of 1839, 17 people died at Willowbend Plantation. Not one death certificate named the real cause. Local doctors burned their notes. County officials literally tore pages from the registry. And when investigators from Savannah finally arrived, they didn't just find silence. They uncovered something far worse. Because beneath the grand plantation house, hidden in a sealed root cellar, lay a truth that challenged everything the antebellum South claimed about medicine, family, and civilization itself. And at the center of it all, one woman, Cordelia Rutledge, whose secret ritual would consume everyone tied to Willowbend. Before we dive deeper, make sure you hit subscribe to Echoes of the Past and drop a comment with your city or state. Your support keeps forgotten American mysteries like this alive. Now, the nightmare begins with a death that no one questioned. In 1838, wealthy men in Georgia died suddenly all the time. At least that's what people told themselves. Burke County stretched across the Savannah River Valley, cotton fields as far as the eye could see. By then, it was one of Georgia's richest regions, over 60 plantations feeding England's textile mills. The county seat, Westboro, was a polished town of 3,000, full of banks, churches, and rigid social order, and just southeast of it sat Willowbend Plantation. 1,400 acres, a towering 3-story mansion with white columns and red brick, 42 enslaved people in the fields, 18 more running the household and stables. The Rutledge family had owned it since 1792, passing it down through generations like a crown jewel. When Cordelia Vance married Thomas Rutledge in 1820, she was just 19. He was 34, a widower, wealthy and respected. The match was practical. Thomas needed heirs and a housekeeper. Cordelia's family needed financial security. She was tall, striking, with dark auburn hair and steel-gray eyes that, according to the enslaved workers, seemed to see right through you. Over the years, she gave Thomas 5 children and became the iron-willed mistress of Willowbend, admired by neighbors for her French cooking, her polished dinners, her ability to run a household like a general. But behind closed doors, Cordelia was different. She kept journals. She ordered medical books from Philadelphia. She studied strange inheritance patterns and wrote about bloodlines late into the night while her husband slept in a separate room, and the enslaved workers noticed too. She walked the fields at dawn, asking them unusual questions about family history and health, studying them as if they were experiments rather than human beings. Thomas, meanwhile, was a typical planter, stern, business-minded, drinking whiskey on the veranda, church every Sunday. But by 1837, his health was failing fast. A digestive complaint, the doctor called it. Weight loss, cramps, a gray, waxy look that wouldn't go away. And who prepared his meals during that decline? Cordelia. She fed him her own tonics, broths, and medicines. On March 3, 1838, Thomas Rutledge was found dead in his bed. He was 52. The official cause, gastric fever with liver complications. Nothing suspicious, the doctor said. These things happened. But Cordelia's reaction was chilling. She didn't weep. She didn't collapse in grief. She calmly organized the funeral, ordered the house draped in black, and buried her husband 3 days later beside his family. Yet the very next morning, before the body was even cold in the ground, she went down to the root cellar and pulled out a locked wooden box. Inside, letters, medical receipts, and a black leather journal. She studied them by lamplight, face blank, then hid the box beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom closet. That same week, she summoned 3 enslaved men, Isaiah Drummond, the carpenter, Caleb Tucker, the blacksmith, and Josiah Mercer, her husband's body servant. Each was unusually skilled, unusually trusted. Each bore the same strange crescent-shaped birthmark on his shoulder blade. And now, Cordelia told them, they would serve her in ways they could never refuse. She said a European physician had instructed her in a new treatment, one that would preserve her health and help her manage the estate. Their help was required, their obedience absolute. And so, 4 days after her husband's burial, Cordelia led them to Turkey Creek, a quiet, spring-fed stream at the edge of the plantation. The morning was gray. Fog clung to the water. The air smelled of wet earth and decay. Cordelia wore a plain gray dress carrying a linen-wrapped bundle. The three men followed separately, silent, tense. What happened next at that creek would mark the beginning of the ritual that consumed Willowbend, and this is only the beginning of Cordelia Rutledge's story. 17 deaths, hidden journals, a secret root cellar, and a lie so powerful an entire county conspired to erase it. Dawn at Willowbend Plantation wasn't like dawn anywhere else. At that gray hour when night and day blur together, the creek by the oaks felt outside of time. Silent, waiting. Cordelia Rutledge walked to a bend where a wide stone jutted into the water, a natural platform. She set down her linen bundle, turned to the three men on the bank, and spoke in a voice as steady as if she were giving farm orders. No emotion, just instructions. They would step into the water with her. All of them. Clothes removed, a circle formed in waist-deep current. She'd carry out ablutions, washings, cuts, recitations, and none of them were to speak of it. Ever, if they did. She promised to sell them straight to a Louisiana sugar plantation, where men rarely lived past 5 years. But the threat wasn't the most terrifying part. It was her certainty. The way she said their names like she knew them. Like she knew their fathers, their blood. Isaiah went first, jaw tight. Caleb followed, his huge frame stiff with tension. Josiah trailed behind, face pale, walking like a man to the gallows. Cordelia dropped her dress without hesitation. Pale, unflinching, she stepped into the icy creek and commanded them into position. A triangle around her, backs turned. Then she opened the bundle. Inside, glass bottles, a razor, cloth, and a small black book. She read from it in a language none of them knew. It sounded like Latin, but not quite. As she chanted, she washed each man in a strict pattern. Shoulders, chest, back, legs. Liquids that burned on the skin. Scents of chemicals and bitter herbs. Then came the razor. Cordelia sliced shallow cuts directly over the crescent-shaped birthmarks on each man's left shoulder blade. She pressed white cloth to collect their blood, mixed it with her strange liquids, and rubbed the mixture onto her own skin while chanting steadily. 30 minutes later, it was over. She ordered them to dress, return at dawn the next day, and walked away without looking back. The men lingered on the bank in silence. Something was gone from them. Something else had replaced it. And the ritual wasn't a one-time horror. It became daily. Every morning, no matter the weather. Always the same elements. The cold creek, the nakedness, the cutting, the chanting. Within 2 weeks. People at Willowbend noticed. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, once the sharpest and most capable workers on the plantation, began slipping. They moved like they were underwater. Their eyes, blank foggy. Conversations shrank into dull one-word exchanges. Rachel, a house servant who'd grown up with Josiah, said it was like he was disappearing from inside his own body. Still there, but hollow, the quarters buzzed with whispers. Mistress Cordelia had learned roots, conjure, dark magic. Maybe from New Orleans. People said she was poisoning the men, stealing their minds. But no one dared confront her. Even Cordelia's own children began to sense it. She left the house before dawn every day and came back with damp hair, claiming she was just walking by the creek for her health. Her youngest believed her. Her eldest, 17-year-old Margaret, did not. Margaret noticed her mother had grown thinner, her eyes brighter, almost feverish. She noticed the black leather book that never left her mother's side. One morning, Margaret tried to follow, but Cordelia was waiting. She grabbed her daughter's wrist so hard it left bruises and whispered that if she ever followed again, if she ever told anyone, she'd never marry, never leave Willowbend, never have a life of her own. That night, Margaret wrote in her diary. She admitted her mother frightened her now. That something unnatural clung to her like a smell, that whatever was happening at the creek was evil. Meanwhile, the spring planting went on. Outwardly, Cordelia looked like the perfect widow, running the estate, managing the accounts, entertaining neighbors. But alone in her candlelit room, she filled page after page of her journals. She recorded every change in Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah, their pulses, their speech, their failing memories. She noted dosages, frequencies, chemical mixtures. She wrote of her own body, the improvements she felt. She scribbled about bloodlines, inheritances, purification. Her handwriting grew jagged, slashing across the page with manic energy. By May, the transformation of the three men couldn't be ignored. All had wasted away. Isaiah, once a master carpenter, now needed written instructions for the simplest repairs. Caleb's ironwork was warped and sloppy. Josiah forgot orders almost instantly, wandering the halls like a sleepwalker. It was then that Dr. Silas Peaton, the county's aging physician, noticed. Cordelia had asked him to examine her youngest daughter's cough. But as he left, he spotted Josiah trembling under a load of firewood. Later, he saw Isaiah fumbling with a shutter, hands shaking. The symptoms struck him as odd. When he asked Cordelia, she brushed it off as recurring ague, common swamp fever. She claimed she was already treating it with quinine and calomel. Peaton nodded politely, but something about her answer stuck in his mind. The symptoms didn't quite match. And more importantly, he saw no signs of the gray-blue discoloration calomel always left behind. He mentioned it later to another doctor over brandy. They debated whether some new fever was spreading among the enslaved population. But for Dr. Peaton, that tiny inconsistency wouldn't go away. And then, in early June, everything changed. Isaiah Drummond collapsed while repairing the plantation's cotton gin. He dropped without warning, unconscious for minutes. When he woke, his face drooped, his words slurred. He couldn't remember what he'd been doing. The overseer reported it immediately to Cordelia. What she did next would only deepen the nightmare-consuming Willowbend plantation. What would you do if the strongest men on a plantation started collapsing one by one, as if something unseen was draining the life right out of them? That's exactly what began happening at Willowbend in the summer of 1838. First, it was Isaiah. He dropped suddenly while working in the carpenter's cabin. No warning, no sickness beforehand. When Cordelia came to see him, she barely looked him over before giving her orders. Keep him shut inside. Feed him nothing but bread and water. And, she added, he'd simply been drinking. But Marcus, the overseer, knew better. Isaiah had never touched alcohol in his life. There was no smell of whiskey on him. 2 days later, Caleb Tucker collapsed at the forge. One moment he was hammering iron, the next his legs just buckled beneath him. The others found him muttering nonsense on the floor, half-conscious. When he finally came around, he couldn't even explain what had happened. Cordelia's response? Exactly the same. Isolation, minimal food. No care beyond that. By now, the enslaved community was terrified. 2 of their strongest, healthiest men who had never been sick a single day, were fading right in front of them. The whispers grew louder. Mistress Cordelia was poisoning them. Or worse, working roots, stealing their souls. Old stories came flooding back. Tales carried from Africa and the Caribbean of people who could hollow out a man, leaving him alive but empty. One evening in June, an elderly woman named Dinah, brought from the Congo long ago, respected as a healer, approached Josiah Mercer. She begged him to tell her what the mistress was doing to him and the others. Josiah only stared at her with those blank, hollow eyes, and said nothing. Desperate, Dinah pressed a small, protective charm into his hand. Roots, stones, a bag of her making. Josiah let it fall to the dirt and walked away without a word. So Dinah did something almost unthinkable. She went to Marcus Delqua, the overseer. She told him flat out that Mistress Cordelia was draining the men's life at the creek every dawn. Marcus snapped at her, called it nonsense, threatened her with the whip if she spread such talk again. But privately, Marcus was unsettled. He'd been watching too. He'd noticed Cordelia slipping out before dawn every single morning, always followed by Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah. He'd seen the men wasting away, and he'd seen something else. Cordelia herself seemed to be thriving. She was glowing, energized, almost younger than before. It was as though whatever was leaving the men was flowing into her. Marcus wasn't a kind man. At 35, born to French-speaking parents in Louisiana, he'd overseen plantations across Georgia and South Carolina. He was hard, practical, but he wasn't blind. Something at Willowbend was breaking the natural order, and he meant to find out what. He began his own quiet investigation. Rising early, timing Cordelia's trips to Turkey Creek, noting every detail, but never going close enough to see the rituals themselves. Something instinct told him it wasn't safe. He also started digging into her past. The house servants whispered that she received letters from Charleston, always in plain, unmarked envelopes. He learned she'd been buying strange supplies from Augusta through a private apothecary connection. And years earlier, she'd spent 2 full years at a girls' academy in Philadelphia, rare for a Southern woman. By the end of June, Marcus had a troubling list of facts. But what could he take to the authorities? That a widow was taking walks with 3 of her slaves. That they were getting sick while she grew healthier. No sheriff would care. Enslaved men died all the time. And unless a white person was in danger, the law wouldn't lift a finger. But Marcus wasn't the only one watching Cordelia, because in Charleston, a man named Victor Kensington had been waiting for her. Kensington was no ordinary physician. At 52, he carried a scandalous reputation, stripped of his license in Pennsylvania for performing unauthorized experiments on asylum patients. He had fled south, reinventing himself as a consultant for the wealthy and desperate. His specialty? What he called vital transfusion therapy, a bizarre mix of bloodletting, chemicals, ritual, and psychological manipulation. He claimed he could transfer youth, energy, even life itself from one person to another. For a price, and Cordelia Rutledge was the perfect client. She'd first met him in 1836 at a private lecture in Charleston. Kensington spoke of European theories about vital force, how aging and illness could be reversed if that force was properly controlled. Cordelia was hooked. In a private consultation afterward, she told him her darkest suspicion. Her husband, Thomas, had secretly arranged for other men, enslaved men, to father her children. She believed Thomas had been sterile from disease, and that he had drugged her, used laudanum, even brought those men to her bed without her knowledge. She believed it completely, and it filled her with rage. She wanted revenge. But more than that, she wanted restoration. Her youth, her strength, her power. Kensington promised her both. For $5,000, he would guide her step by step. He sent detailed instructions, chemical compounds, and rituals. She would need 3 subjects, men who fit her suspicions, men marked by the same crescent-shaped birthmark she had seen on her children. Isaiah, Caleb, Josiah. The rituals combined everything: mercury, arsenic, plant alkaloids, bloodletting, chants that sounded scientific but were little more than twisted theater. The chemicals destroyed their nervous systems while convincing Cordelia she was absorbing their life, and she believed it. What Cordelia never knew was that Kensington was also reporting her progress to someone else, a shadowy figure in Burke County who had their own plans. And those plans would one day bring Cordelia's nightmare crashing down. By July 1838, the air was thick with heat. The cotton grew heavy in the fields. But at Willowbend, beneath the oaks by Turkey Creek, something far darker was flourishing. And what happened next would shake the plantation to its core. What if I told you that behind the doors of a grand southern plantation, a woman's obsession would destroy not only herself, but everyone around her? This is the story of Cordelia Rutledge, a tale of cruelty, madness, and secrets buried so deep that when they finally came to light, they tore a family apart. At Willowbend, the summer heat was unbearable. The family hid in the coolest rooms, trying to sleep through the afternoons. But Cordelia? She never stopped. Her dawn rituals grew harsher by the day. She increased the chemicals she forced on 3 enslaved men, Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah. She made them stay in the creek for hours, rubbed caustic substances onto their skin, and made them swallow bitter concoctions. She even began collecting their bodily fluids, convinced it was all part of a cure. But it was killing them. Their skin turned waxy, their eyes hollow. Isaiah could no longer move. Caleb collapsed again and again. Only Josiah remained able to work, but his eyes were empty, his body just going through the motions. Then came the turning point. Marcus de Aqua, the overseer, finally had proof. While Cordelia entertained visitors, Marcus snuck into her room. Under a loose floorboard, he found a locked box. Inside, Kensington's letters, spelling out every step of the treatments, and Cordelia's journals describing everything in chilling detail. Worst of all, there was a half-finished letter to Kensington where Cordelia admitted she wasn't even sure the rituals worked, and feared she was just murdering 3 innocent men. Marcus didn't hesitate. He grabbed the most damning papers and rode straight to Westboro, to attorney Howard Pritchard, a man who was both ambitious and ruthless. Pritchard saw opportunity. Yes, Cordelia's cruelty to enslaved people wouldn't move a court. But her journals, her letters, they were proof she was delusional, unfit to manage her husband's estate. If they could prove her insane, the courts would strip her power and hand Willowbend to a guardian. one chosen by men like Pritchard. But they had to wait. Let Cordelia spiral further, then strike. What Marcus didn't know was that Cordelia had already noticed the break-in. A tiny scratch on the floorboard gave it away. She checked the box and realized Marcus had betrayed her. Her response? Swift, cold, deadly. That night she fired him, ordered him off the plantation before sunrise. She promised if he spread lies, she'd ruin him with her Charleston connections. But Marcus didn't leave empty-handed. He had hidden letters in his saddlebags. And now, with Pritchard's help, the case against her grew. Cordelia scrambled to replace him. She promoted a driver named Samuel Gentry, but he lacked authority. The enslaved people sensed weakness, slowed their work, resisted in small ways. Cordelia lashed out. Harsher punishments, more whippings, rations cut, curfews enforced. Willowbend became a place of fear, but her rituals at the creek never stopped. And on July 28, 1838, Isaiah Drummond finally died. His body just gave up. Cordelia buried him quickly, writing in the ledger that it was fever and consumption. Instead of stopping, she doubled down on Caleb and Josiah. That was the breaking point for Margaret, Cordelia's daughter. Terrified by her mother's madness, she secretly wrote to her aunt in Charleston, Catherine Vance. She described the dawn rituals, Isaiah's death, the two men wasting away. The letter reached Charleston in 10 days. Catherine was horrified. She immediately wrote to the family doctor, Dr. Peaton, urging him to investigate. She also contacted the county judge, warning that Cordelia might not be fit to control the estate, and suddenly, Cordelia was surrounded. Pritchard building his case on one side, Catherine pushing from the other. On August 20th, Dr. Peaton arrived. At first, Cordelia refused to let him see Caleb and Josiah. But eventually, she gave in. What he saw shocked him. Caleb was emaciated, barely conscious. His gums were blue-gray from mercury poisoning. His skin was scarred by chemical burns. His body shook uncontrollably. Josiah was in the same state. Peaton confronted Cordelia, and here, her mask cracked. She told him everything. About Kensington's European protocol, the baths, the chemicals. About how the transfer of strength was real. That the men weren't victims. They were necessary. Peaton told her bluntly, this wasn't medicine. It was murder. He promised to report her. Cordelia's response? Calm, chilling. She told him the men had violated her, participated in her husband's betrayal. They deserved it. And besides, she was stronger now. Days later, Peaton filed his report. Combined with Marcus's documents, the case was undeniable. On September 3rd, Sheriff Benjamin Talmadge arrived with a court order. Cordelia was to face a medical tribunal to decide if she was insane. The examination lasted 4 hours. The doctors pressed her on every detail. She tried to appear rational, but her obsession showed through. She defended Kensington's protocols. She showed no remorse for Isaiah's death. She spoke of her children's bloodlines and Thomas's betrayal with icy certainty. The panel's verdict? Unanimous. Cordelia Rutledge was insane. Catherine Vance was appointed guardian of the children and estate. She arrived in mid-September, took control of Willowbend, locked Cordelia in her room, and ended the creek rituals forever. But the fallout was far from over. Investigators in Charleston uncovered Kensington's fraud and something even darker. They found his correspondence with Pritchard, revealing that Pritchard had been feeding the fire all along. He had intended to use Cordelia's downfall to seize Willowbend for himself. Exposed, Pritchard fled, disbarred in disgrace. Marcus testified, admitting he had been used as a pawn. And then came the final twist. A private detective uncovered the truth about Thomas Rutledge. He really had suffered from MS and likely was sterile. But instead of arranging assaults, as Cordelia believed, he had fathered children with enslaved women years earlier. Isaiah, Caleb, and Josiah weren't her violators. They were Thomas's children, which meant they were her children's half-brothers. Cordelia had sensed the resemblance. She had pieced together a partial truth, but in her paranoia, she twisted it into something monstrous. And in trying to fight a lie, she became the murderer. By the end of September, Caleb was dead. Josiah lived, but brain damaged, a broken remnant of who he'd been. Cordelia was never tried for murder. Under the law, The killing of enslaved people was destruction of property, not homicide. Catherine, desperate to protect the children, committed her quietly to an asylum. Cordelia spent 14 years there, writing endless journals the staff destroyed. She died of pneumonia in 1852, never once admitting she was wrong. The children were raised in Charleston. Margaret married and left Georgia. Thomas Jr. sold Willowbend in 1856, never wanting to see it again. And Victor Kensington? He vanished. Never seen again, so. Was Cordelia a monster? Or a victim of deception who lost herself to madness? That's the question history leaves us with. What do you think? Thomas Rutledge, a so-called doctor, vanished in the early 1840s. Some said he'd slipped into New Orleans, working under a new name, still peddling his fake cures. Others swore he'd escaped to Mexico, or maybe even South America. Wherever he went, he left behind dozens of broken victims across the South, people he tricked with promises of youth and stolen vitality. By 1850, his name had completely disappeared from medical directories, as if he'd been erased from history. But what he left behind at Willowbend was far worse than fraud. Rutledge had fathered several children with enslaved women on the plantation. The ones Cordelia didn't kill were eventually sold off once Catherine Vance took control of the estate. Their descendants scattered across Georgia, never knowing their bloodline tied back to the Rutledge name. Willowbend itself carried on for a while, passed between different owners until the Civil War. In 1864, Sherman's troops burned the main house to the ground during the infamous March to the Sea. By 1880, the once grand plantation had been carved into 6 smaller farms, and Willowbend was little more than a fading memory. Yet the land itself, never forgot. Turkey Creek still runs cold through that soil. But the spot where Cordelia carried out her rituals grew tangled with weeds and silence. In the 1870s, freedmen refused to go near it. They wouldn't fish there, wouldn't wash their clothes in that water. They told their children, that place is cursed. By the 1890s, even white farmers avoided the bend. No one could quite say why, just that the air felt heavier there, that birds refused to sing in the cypress trees. And then, something surfaced. In 1891, a farmer plowing former Willowbend land dug up a wooden box, buried 3 feet down. Inside, rusted medical tools, broken bottles with traces of strange chemicals, and papers so water-damaged they were almost unreadable. Disturbed, the man quietly reburied the box. He told only his wife. When he died years later, she burned his diary, destroying his description of the find, saying only that some secrets should stay buried, but not everything stayed hidden. In 1899, the death of a wealthy widow named Catherine Vance revealed the most disturbing piece of all. When attorney Robert Denore sorted through her belongings, he discovered a locked trunk filled with letters and documents about Cordelia's crimes. One letter stood out. Cordelia had written it herself in 1846, from inside the asylum. Denore read it once, and then destroyed it. Years later, he told a colleague why. Cordelia's words were a window into an abyss. She admitted she had murdered innocent men. She admitted her doctor was a fraud. She admitted she twisted fragments of truth into paranoia and horror. But worst of all, even knowing all of that, she said she would do it again. That wasn't madness, Denore said. That was understanding her madness and choosing it anyway. He burned most of the letters, but kept a few scraps, asylum receipts, a short note Margaret had written about her mother's final moments, and one chilling page from Cordelia's own journal. It was dated March 10, 1838, just 3 days into the Turkey Creek rituals. Cordelia wrote, "I've begun the treatments." The subjects responded as expected. At first I felt nothing, but today I felt something. Maybe it was only the cold water. Maybe it was the satisfaction of finally taking action. Or maybe the treatments work. Even if doubt whispers that I'm only killing 3 men to feed a delusion, the doubt itself must die. Faith is part of the cure. I must believe. That page survived, hidden in the Denore family archives until 1947, when it was donated to the Georgia Historical Society. To this day, it remains locked away in their restricted collection, too disturbing to be put on display. In Burke County, the story of Cordelia Rutledge twisted into folklore. By the 1920s, most thought it was nothing more than a ghost story about dangerous waters. The last living person who truly remembered was Sarah Drummond, born in 1835, the niece of one of Cordelia's victims, Isaiah Drummond. She lived to 106, dying in 1941. Even in her final years, she would cry when recalling her uncle's fate. Isaiah, she said, told her the worst part wasn't dying. The worst part was forgetting who he was while he was still alive, piece by piece, until nothing was left of him but a body. And with Sarah's passing, the last first-hand memory of the Willowbend horror was gone. What's left now is only fragments. A few scorched letters, one torn journal page, the whisper of a legend passed down like a warning, and Turkey Creek itself flowing on, ordinary to the eye, but heavy with memory. So, what do you think? Was Cordelia a victim of her circumstances, pushed past sanity? Or was she a murderer who used her pain as an excuse for cruelty? Could anyone have stopped the horror at Turkey Creek before it was too late? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if this chilling tale pulled you in, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves dark mysteries. I'll see you in the next story.